Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Underneath. I'm decided, given the events out of Detroit, the news out of Detroit, Sacred Heart Seminary, that I would do a live stream here on Saturday. But thank you so far for you guys who have showed up. I appreciate it. I'm going to do my best today to not waste your time or bore you. So to that end, I am pleased to bring on my good friend, fellow podcaster at GaudiumEtSpes22.com, the one and the only Larry Chapp. Larry, how you doing, brother?
I'm doing great, and let's call this an emergency podcast.
Yes, that's right. That's right. I sent out the bat signal last night. I was like, Larry, because and I'll tell you. So anyway, folks, what we're talking about today is the situation in Sacred Heart Seminary in Detroit Archdiocese. Bishop Weisenburger, about 2-3 days ago, fired Martin and Echeverria, right?
Yes, Ralph Martin. And Eduardo Echeverria, and yesterday it came out he also fired the canonist Ed Peters.
Yeah, so it was interesting, right, Larry? Because when the first two things happened, we kind of exchanged, as we do, exchanged some messages back and forth. Yeah, this is pretty bad. And you kind of said at the time, they're certainly on the older side, but it definitely doesn't feel good. It doesn't seem good at all. But at that point, you and I both said, well, there's probably enough plausible deniability sort of to give the sense that whatever, right? But when yesterday, when the canonist Ed Peters was sacked and he announced it on X and elsewhere, I just suddenly had a different feel for this whole thing.
Yeah, something that through plausible deniability could be, hey, I'm just getting rid of really old guys and I'm going to replace them with very young priests, up and comers. Mm-hmm. Of course, Ed Peters is 68. He's no spring chicken, but sure. I looked it up. I didn't know that off the top of my head. I looked it up.
Yeah,
but still, 68. That's not too old. University professors, seminary professors routinely teach into their 70s. No, Ralph Martin, I think, is almost 83 years old. Yeah. Eduardo is 74. So yeah, okay, we're getting rid of. No, this now has all of the earmarks of a purge.
Right. So that's the question, right? And we put up, is it some kind of trend? So it's a purge. I think you and I are both in agreement, especially given the events of yesterday. It's a purge, right? Why?
Well, especially in the light of the fact, this is one of Pope Francis's last appointments of a bishop before he died in the United States. So thank you so much, Pope Francis, for yet another parting gift. Yeah. All right, to the church, which is yet another very autocratic, non-synodal, non-listening, non-parrhesia, liberal progressive bishop cut out of the same cloth as the 1970s liberal tyrants that ran roughshod over the church, all in the name of dialogue. That's the thing that sticks out to me here. The guy isn't a bishop more than 4 months. He bans the Latin Mass, tells his priests, his Novus Ordo priests, you can't do Mass ad orientem either. You can't hand out communion to people that are kneeling, all this kind of stuff. And then he follows that up with, and the following 3 professors at my seminary are summarily fired. And by the way, I'm not going to give them any, there's a fly buzzing around my head. There's not a reason I'm going to give them. Even if they ask me, I'm going to say, talk to the palm. So there's no dialogue. In other words, if this is what synodalism is, and I think it is, I think we're seeing what synodality means. It's simply liberal code for, we're going to talk issues to death until we're in charge, and then you're out. And there won't be any more talking. That's what's going on here.
Yeah,
I'm in charge now. You're out.
Yeah, you and I have talked about the idea. Our suspicions have been for quite some time that the synodality, this new way of being church, as the patois goes, we suspected it was a Trojan horse, and I have come to think of it as a kind of cover story, right? That it gives a kind of cover for listening because you can selectively listen. Right. You can listen to who you want to listen, and it kind of gives everybody, we can talk, we can chat. And, look, we're getting buy-in. But at the end of the day, to just sort of wade through here and just can these guys is a pretty stark thing.
Especially since, the previous podcast, you and I were talking about traditionis custodes, and we were talking about what easy scapegoating targets traditionalists made. Right. And so you developed this cartoonish caricature of your average traditionalist. Every traditionalist is now Peter Kwasniewski. Every single one, all right? Or Patrick Coffin. Every single one. That's who they are, and it's not true. So it's a boogeyman. That's your favorite word. It's a boogeyman that got set up. Now, however, okay, neither Ralph Martin nor Eduardo Echeverria nor Ed Peters are traditionalists. So as you said to me in a private message, are we seeing now here a move to actually now purge not traditionalists, but just more conservative leaning theologians? And I wrote back to you and I said, well, this was already done by Pope Francis when he purged the John Paul II Institute of theologians who actually, liked John Paul.
Well, yeah,
of the Communio school.
Right.
And
so for our audience,
go ahead.
Yeah, I was just saying, for our audience's sake, tell us a little bit about that, because there's a John Paul the Institute of Marriage and Family in Rome, and there's a John Paul II Institute of Marriage and Family in D.C. What happened, and when did that happen, and how did that go down?
Well, it happened. They didn't touch the one in D.C.
Right.
And thank God they didn't. I don't know when it happened. 10 years ago now, 8 years ago. It was towards the beginning of the Francis papacy.
It was right after the Synod on the Family, I believe.
It was right after the Synod on the Family, because as you recall, after the Synod on the Family, those cardinals submitted the dubia. How do we now interpret certain problematic things here?
Right.
And within a month or two of that synod being over, I do believe, Pope Francis moved against the John Paul II Institute in Rome, and he summarily fired the leader of the institute, replaced him with the infamous Archbishop Paglia.
Yes.
Yes, and summarily fired all kinds of tenured faculty members there. Well, I don't know if they had tenure, but Michael, long-standing. In other words, he violated every academic rule in the faculty handbook about how do you deal with personnel. And Pope Francis said, no, you guys are out. And he replaced them with fairly progressive, liberal, consequentialist, moral theologian types. They don't call it that anymore. It's like, oh, we're going to deal with mitigating circumstances and concrete lived experiences, which the old guys never considered, and all that kind of garbage. All right. And then he did the same thing with the Pontifical Academy for Life, where he took perfectly good conservative communal ressourcement type theologians, not trads. All right. And he purged them out.
I want the reason why I'm sticking on this point, Larry, is that, you can get into the sort of the backstage politics, but symbolically, why is the John Paul II Institute on Marriage and Family such a significant thing for the life of the church, especially in the time that you and I have been alive and paying attention to things?
Well, for a billion reasons. First off, because it's such a darn important issue. The attack on the family, the attack on the concept of marriage from James Martin all the way across, that gays can get married and so on and so forth, and the church needs to embrace this. There's a crisis in our society and now in our church with regard to marriage.
Right.
John
Paul II, he saw that, right? John Paul II saw this early on in his pontificate. Of course, his famous theology of the body was in part is scripted, drawn up to address what he saw as the primary battleground for the life of the church in the wake of the council, which was marriage and family, right?
One of his first documents after his own synod on the bishop was an apostolic exhortation, Familiaris Consortio, that dealt with the family, which became a kind of Magna Carta in the same way that Amoris Laetitia did for Pope Francis followers. And then he wrote Veritatis Splendor, Evangelium Vitae, and on and on and on. The reason why the JP Church in Rome is so significant is because we have barely scratched the surface of retrieving and appropriating the intellectual theological legacy of St. Pope John Paul II, an intellectual giant who sat on the chair of Peter, whose thought is now just sort of summarily treated as yesterday's news. Well, he's gone, he's dead. Time to move on to LGBTQ and Father Martin and a synod on the family, where we just say, hey, this is what got. Let's return to the
sacred, so I just wanted to lay that out. I just wanted to lay that out for the audience, that in the last 50 years, let's call it 40 years, a concerted effort was made by the church, the hierarchy specifically, under the leadership of John Paul II and, of course, Benedict XVI, really to move to buttress and to strengthen our conceptions and the continuity of marriage as the sort of the first teacher of all Christians, right? And so a wrecking ball was made to that institute. And again, the politics thing aside, just symbolically, it was such a significant move. Okay, so now,
yes.
okay, so let's then move. Okay, so that all happened, and we lived through the rest of the Francis papacy. Okay, fine. Okay, so then Detroit. Let's get to Detroit.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to talk too much about Ralph Martin. Ralph Martin's 83 years old. I'm not a huge Ralph Martin fan. I'm just going to say that right up front. He and I have locked horns. He's his dissertation is basically, here's why most people are going to hell. I know people are going to scream at me now. Oh, I don't say that. I don't say that. But he's hypercritical of anybody that would even hope that a majority of people are saying.
Yeah, it's like in his crosshairs is universalism as he sees it, right? That's
fine. Oh yeah, and he had a whole chapter in his book, chapter 6 of Christ of the Church. I think it was chapter 6, called Satanic Deceptions. And he leads off with Hans Urs von Balthasar as one of the chief satanic deceivers.
Yeah, sure.
And a chapter that dealt with Nazis and Stalin and everything else. I mean, it's just, it was just over the top and outrageous. So, no. Okay, so but, the reason why I mention that is because even though I am not a Ralph Martin fan, I think it was wrong to fire him in the way that he was fired. He's 83 years old. I don't particularly care for his theology, but he has served the church well. He has done his bit for king and country. He is much revered and beloved by a large segment of Catholics that are out there. Irrespective of my differences with him, I freely acknowledge that he has been overall a good force within the church. He's one of the good guys. Yeah. Okay. And furthermore, why weren't he and Eduardo, despite them being advanced in years, simply called into the bishop's office for a little parrhesia, a little conversation, and say, okay, look, I want you guys out, but I'm going to give you a chance to lead with dignity. I'm going to give you a chance to retire, to announce your retirements and so on. And let's just keep this conversation between us secret. Why don't you guys just go out and do your thing and move on. So let's do it that way. No, he just summarily fires them. Doesn't want to give them a reason. And I don't care what you think of the theology of either Eduardo or Ralph Martin. That is not the way you deal with people that have taught in your seminary for 20 years, 30 years, and so on. Right. It's just not the way you deal with it. It smacks of a kind of autocratic, clericalistic authoritarianism. Now, I want to move on to Eduardo, too.
Yeah, go ahead.
The accusation by now, the choir of Mike Lewis, Andrew Lakutis, Michael Lofton, every word that comes out of the Pope's mouth is an oracular truth that we have to dig in and defend. I know that's a caricature of their view, but I'm telling you, the net effect of their attacks on anybody that criticizes the Pope for any reason whatsoever, it kind of does boil down to what Monsignor Guarino refers to as infallibility bloat. That you take the fact that the Pope is infallible in matters of faith and morals when he speaks ex cathedra, and then there's this bloat that happens so that every single papal document that ever gets written can no longer be criticized. Several people have written to me and said, you need to talk about when it's right to criticize the Pope, when it's not right to criticize the Pope. And that's a valid conversation to have. And maybe it's a conversation that the Archbishop should have had with Ralph Martin and Eduardo in the extent that they have publicly criticized Pope Francis, as have I. All right. But the fact is that there are extremes. There's the extreme of, say, back in the JP2 days of a Hans Kung or Richard McBrien who couldn't say a good thing about John Paul II. I mean, people ever. Yeah, there have been dissenters from papal teaching, and now, of course, the liberals are screaming with delight because for decades conservatives have been saying to Hans Kung and Skilebecks and those guys, "Hey, pay attention to Rome. You got to obey the Pope. You got to listen to Paul VI. You got to listen to Humanae Vitae. You got to listen to JP2." And they're saying, "I know you don't." So now all of a sudden conservatives get a Pope they don't like, Pope Francis, and it's like, okay, it's open season. We're going to criticize like crazy. Now all of a sudden nobody's an ultramontanist anymore. So in one sense, this is a healthy, my point is, this is actually a very healthy conversation for the church to have. There was too much papalatry. There was too much of a cult of charismatic personality around the Pope. And there really was. So what we have to do is we have to come to some sort of adjudication as to what does faithful criticism of a Pope look like? What does respectful criticism of a Pope look like? Okay. And I would argue that, to come back to, say, Eduardo Echeverria and Amoris Laetitia, Eduardo's entire critique of Pope Francis was that of a respectful theologian who looked at Amoris Laetitia chapter 8 and criticized certain aspects of it as being out of sync with the tradition. Mm-hmm. And the fact of the matter is this: empirically speaking, Eduardo Echeverria, Dr. Echeverria, is completely correct. Mm-hmm. All right. Mm-hmm. And so are we not allowed to point out? I don't care what Mike Lewis or Pedro Gabriel or Mike Lofton or Andrew Lakuta say. There are elements of chapter 8 of, for example, I don't know what section it is. You can look it up. There's an element there where Pope Francis is talking about people that find themselves in difficult life situations that are out of sync with the church's teaching. Mm-hmm. Presumably, he's talking about, say, two people that are married outside of the church that have children together, and they can't really get an annulment or mm-hmm. for whatever reason, and they can't live lives of sexual continence as brother and sister. That's impossible for them. That's just impossible for them. Yeah. So the Pope Francis then goes on to say, well, those people, after a period of discernment, can come to the conclusion in the depth of their conscience that God is okay with this, that God blesses their efforts because, and here's the kicker, there is an acknowledgement that in their current situation, this is the best that they can offer to God at this time. This is the best they can do at this time. Now, all Eduardo has pointed out is that's hugely problematic. Yeah, that's not in sync with the church's traditional teaching at all. I call it it's good enoughism. It's good enoughism. Best I can. No, that's not what it is. It's best I can do ism. What if I came forward and said, you know what? I'm really trying to believe in the divinity of Christ and the Trinity, but I just can't. So that's the best I can do right now. So give me communion. I'm in communion with you. I don't believe half of these doctrines, but it's the best I can do right now. Mm-hmm. All right. That's the best I can offer God is I think Jesus was a great prophet. That's it. Right. Nobody would accept that. You say, well, wait a minute. No. That's not how it works. But all of a sudden in the moral domain, we're supposed to just roll over and accept, well, best I can do ism. All right. Oh, well, yeah, I live with my girlfriend, but that's the best I can do right now for God because I'm weak. No. And Eduardo has criticized that. And that's a perfectly valid, respectful criticism to make, to ask the Pope, could you please clarify this? How is this in sync with traditional Catholic teaching that you can never deliberately choose an evil action? And that there's never such a thing as I'm forced to do an evil action. So anyway, I'm on a bit of a rant, but I'm here defending Eduardo. This is to me, that's an example of respectful criticism of a Pope. Now, you're not allowed to do that. Are we now all supposed to simply bow down to every document that a Pope issues and say, Ich schwöre bei Gott und the papacy? It becomes, you read some of these defenses now of every single problem. No, furthermore, there's no acknowledgement that there are differences between popes. Some are better than others, but they get treated by the defenders of Francis. Well, a pope is a pope is a pope is a pope. And the Holy Spirit, blesses them all equally. So we have to obey them all equally. Well, there have been some really crappy popes in the history of the church. And so are we not allowed to make an adjudication and say, you know what? Pope Francis actually represented a singular crisis in the church. He really did represent a kind of disruption that we have to take into account. And it's what created the traditionalist movement. All of these people got red-pilled. All of these JP2 conservative types. All right, Francis comes in. He starts upsetting the apple cart, and it made a mess. Okay, and then they get
Hagan Leo,
right? And so, I would argue that the Pope Francis papacy represented a unique papacy, and most of his critics, like myself and others, acknowledge this. We don't like criticizing the Pope. We're conservative, believing Catholics who believe in the chair of Peter. A priest friend of mine, Father Sirico, said to me, we have to be careful in our criticism of Pope Francis because we want a papacy left when he's gone. Yeah. All right. And no wiser words. Yeah, and that's real, Yeah. When you go down the Patrick Coffin Bene Vacantis position or Sede Vacantis position, you do great damage to the papacy as such. There's no recovering from that kind of nonsense. Right. And so, no, it didn't. From Eduardo Echeverria to Ralph Martin to Ed Peters to myself and to others, pained us to be critical of Pope Francis in places.
Well, and if you remember,
we tried to be measured about it,
right? And remember the long decade, right? The dozen years or so. I mean, if you're being sober in looking back over the time, the regime of Pope Francis, most people, and I mean most, like 99.9% of the people who care about this stuff, who watch this stuff, who study this stuff, were very, very slow in coming out to even speak up against Pope Francis, some of the things that he was doing. And
hey, I don't mean to interrupt you, but do you know who was a big defender the first couple of years of the Francis papacy? Taylor Marshall.
Yeah. Right.
Taylor Marshall started as a defender of the papacy of Pope Francis. And I again, started as a defender of the papacy of Pope Francis.
And remember, like, there's a dynamic, there's a sort of the human dimension of this dynamic is that why did you or a Taylor Marshall, like you're two different guys, right? Why would both of you be so reticent to speak up in the early portions of the papacy? Right. Well, the way that I see it is that the reticence is due in part to the natural piety and the natural sense of deference that you have as a faithful and loyal son of the church, not to just sort of start shooting from the hip as soon as the Pope burps wrong, right? So the dynamic was very slow rolling, and I remember myself, who am I? But whatever, I'm a dude hosting a live stream right now. And, I remember just sort of like raising my eyebrows from time to time, just be like, oh, really? All right. Well, but look, he's the Pope and, da-da-da-da, and, the gates of hell and all that sort of stuff. Right. And it was slow in coming. But then there was a trickle, and then there became a little bit of a flow, and then even a torrent. And what I think is important to point out, Larry, and I wonder what you think about this, is that why aren't we taking the history of papal criticism to count for how people have arrived where they have arrived?
Yeah, and that is not taken into account by the critics of the critics. It's not at all.
No, they're called heretics. They're called heretics.
For
daring to say anything against a pope. It's like, wait, is that now the definition? Words used to mean something, Larry. Like being orthodox used to mean something beyond saluting. And I got to tell you, it kind of boils my blood every time people sort of blithely throw around the word orthodoxy, to as you said, nod in a sense to the infallibility blow.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy when you say Ralph Martin's a heretic, Eduardo Echeverria is a heretic, Cardinal Burke is a heretic, or as they say, we're all schismatics. We're all schismatics.
Yeah.
We're all heretics and schismatics. That means they've never seen a real heretic and they've never seen a real schismatic. And this is just stupid rhetoric. It's stupid internet rhetoric. Mm-hmm. That's all it is. I mean, the fact is, when you look at, for example, fiducia supplicans, for example, which, Ralph Martin was critical of, Eduardo was critical of, I was critical of, every African bishop.
The entirety of the African bishopric was critical
of. Many South Americans were critical of. Many North Americans and Europeans were critical of. I mean, because it really did sort of green light blessing this idea. Well, we're making a distinction between individuals who come together as a couple and ask for a blessing and blessing that couple. We're not blessing the union. We're blessing a couple of people that come. Do you think we're stupid?
Yeah.
I mean, we saw immediately James Martin. James Martin called a press conference and blessed at last I can bless my gay friends in their union and blah, 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 blah. When specifically fiducia supplicans says you can't do that. You're not supposed to do that. You can't do that. But of course, it said that. But the subtext is, the context is, you can do that.
Yeah.
That's exactly what we're saying you can do. Right. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, say no more.
Right.
And the fact is, the entire sentient Catholic world understood, both those who loved fiducia supplicans and those who hated it, understood that that's what, but no, the grand Orthodox conservative defenders of Pope Francis, like, oh no, we have to make all of these fine distinctions. And if you dissent from it, you're a heretic. That's the point of this ramble. Right. Not that means 3/4 of the church is heretics.
Right.
And it's just insane. So it's just, once again, it's a pope is a pope is a pope. Apparently, no distinctions getting made. And a papal document, therefore, every papal document is sort of a zero-sum game. They're all lined up, and you have to accept every word. But what do you do when a current papal document contradicts a papal document from before?
That's exactly right. And that's the point that I want to get to. It's like, we have to keep pretending that every day is year zero. Right, because
right.
and like there's something inherently small c conservative about being a Christian, right? Because we're constantly trying to understand our moment in the specific context of supernatural revelation in the person of Jesus Christ and the church that he established and the patrimony that we are the beneficiaries of. And to think that you can just sort of develop your way out of it, or the church has a new understanding. I'm like, well, really? We just have a new understanding. So
it's a new paradigm.
Right. So the way in which my great-grandparents were faithful now, in light of 2025, they were unfaithful. Are we going backwards and excommunicating people backwards now?
Yeah, I don't understand. We should be. That kind of papal positivism is kind of what I call it.
Well, what is that? Explain what you mean by papal
positivism. Is simply that papal documents are read like a fundamentalist, biblical literalist Protestant reads the Bible. That every word is simply literally true. What one does not have to take into account the historical context of a scriptural verse, perhaps the worldview of the author of the scriptural verse, what issues were sort of lurking behind the scenes of the scriptural verse. No, every verse is just simply equally true, like little factoid nuggets. It's a very modern actual understanding of truth.
Right.
Truth is not participatory. It's not accepted as a kind of contemplative gift and so on that one has to. No, it's just little nugget factoids of truth. And so they used to be called Denzinger Catholics or Denzinger theologians.
Well, explain that.
Denzinger is a book that has simply a compendium of a very Catholic doctrine out there with the level of theological authority that each doctrine has. And so you had these theologians that would simply say, well, what does Denzinger say? And start listing on it. It didn't matter what the historical context was of any of the documents or whatever the teachings. Right. It's like, this is so that's
kind of, it's interesting I hear you saying this. It's the equivalent of asking Grok a question, a Denzinger.
Well, that's exactly right. And so Grok or any kind of AI or Chat GPT can which knows all of these papal documents,
spit it all out.
Okay, here's your answer, because this is what Pope Vigida said 900 years ago in an obscure papal bull. Now, so a papal positivism would say, well, if the Pope says it, it must be true. And here's the latest dictum from on high. Here's the latest oracle from the Tiber. All right. And so go ahead.
So are you familiar with Brideshead Revisited?
Well, yes.
Yeah, there's the great character, the great North American Canadian Rex Mottram, who's trying to marry into the Brideshead family. And he's taking instruction to become a Catholic so that he can marry Julia, I think her name is. And he's receiving his instruction, and he basically says a version of that, doesn't he? If it's raining outside and the Pope says it's not raining, then it's not raining, right, Father? And of course the priest is like, no, that's not how this thing works, so.
Yeah, and I don't want to platform him more than he deserves, because he deserves nothing, but his name is in the news. Ed Fazer, not Ed, Ed's great, and on Twitter, X, pointed out the other day, he retweeted something that Mike Lewis had tweeted, which was that if the Pope comes out tomorrow and says we can ordain women as priests, then that will become the teaching of the church, and there shouldn't be any problem with that, because it's a papal teaching now.
And there's a post. It's real. It's in ink or whatever. It's an electronic ink.
That's right. It's real. Okay. So Ed Fazer, and this is a perfect example of papal positivism.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Even though it directly contradicts an almost infallible statement, we'll put it. The status of John Paul's teaching on women priests is a bit ambiguous as to whether or not John Paul proposed it as an ex-cathedra teaching.
But his wording was pretty clear, right? So why don't you remind us of the wording of what his reasoning was?
I hereby parents, the successor of St. Peter, and that all, in order to eliminate all controversy, all confusion, all question, I hereby teach and affirm that the church has no authority whatsoever to confirm priestly ordination on women. He doesn't explicitly use the classic language of ex cathedra, but my God,
it's pretty darn close. It's pretty darn close.
Whatever the truth of that question is, the fact is, I think a good case could be made out that it is such an authoritative teaching from the Pope. Then on the backs of a clear 2,000-year-old teaching of the ordinary magisterium, that we don't ordain women as priests, and the practice of the Eastern churches as well. You take all of that cumulatively together, and what Ed Fazer's point is that Mike Lewis and those who think like Mike Lewis are presenting to us a very problematical theological picture of the papacy as this great. You remember Etch-a-Sketch when you were a kid? You could just shake it, and whatever you had made on it, it's gone. It's gone.
And that's what I'm saying, Larry.
An Etch-a-Sketch.
Right. That's what I'm saying. Like, this is like, it's constant year zero. Like, we just get to start over every time. And you cannot have a supernatural church with supernatural claims that can just be Etch-a-Sketched, shaken away. You just can't do it.
Yeah. Or those things where it had like, you'd write with a stylus on this piece of, and then you'd lift up the plastic and everything would go away and you could write again. I mean, I'm 66, so these were the toys we had in the 60s and 70s.
No iPads for you growing up, Larry.
Yeah. But I think others have similar experience. I mean, it's essentially year zero. And Joseph Ratzinger criticizes that very point of view in his book Principles of Catholic Theology. In talking about the Second Vatican Council, he criticizes those who view the Vatican Council as a kind of great reset, as if everything in the church is now at year zero. And this is an important point. One of the hallmarks precisely of the progressive Catholic mentality since the council and up till today is, as Dominique Marie Chanoux, the Dominican theologian, so influential at the council, have said that what the council did was it placed the church in a position of permanent revolution.
Right.
And he meant that he meant that positively. He was
for that. Yeah, our audience should understand that he was saying this as if it were a good thing.
Yeah, and I mean, this has been the mantra of progressive Catholic thought since the Vatican Council is not important in terms of what it actually said. Right. It's important as an event that created a rupture with the past and therefore a dynamic for the future, where the church is in a constant state of change and flux and listening to the signs of the times and accommodating ourselves to modernity and so on and so forth. And this is a mentality that they are now employing in the light of Pope Francis, that, okay, now we have a Pope who thinks like us. So if the Pope comes out tomorrow and says that we don't have a Trinity anymore, or we don't believe in the divinity of Christ anymore, and we don't believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist anymore, by definition, Mike Lewis, Mike Lofton, and all these other guys are going to have to say, well, that's the teaching of the church now, because a Pope said so. A Pope said so. Well,
and of course, it's the worst kind of stereotype about papal authority. It's kind of gross, and it's like, and honestly, I was thinking about this today. It's like, why even read a book? Like why even do theology, right? If I'm just going to sort of wait to hear from the oracle, which of course is a marker of Christianity. A marker of Christianity is that there's some sort of deposit, and that we can think through the deposit, and we can work through revelation, and we can try to come to understand what revelation means now. But this sort of unhinged, ungrounded exercise just seems silly, and I think you're right. It strikes me as just perpetually petulant.
Some people listening might say, well, what does this have to do with what's going on in Detroit at Sacred Heart Seminary? It has everything to do with it.
Right.
Because what we're trying to do is to place the actions of Archbishop Weisenburger in a kind of theological, historical context, and to ask the question, is that what he's doing? Is Archbishop Weisenburger, in light of his approach to the Latin Mass, Ad Orientem worship and Novus Ordo liturgies, in light of these recent moves, the question we're asking is, what kind of theological vision does he have for the Archdiocese of Detroit? And is this a harbinger of things to come? Are we now under Pope Leo? Because Pope Leo was then simply Cardinal Prevost in charge of the dicastery for bishops. So he had a hand in selecting this bishop. That doesn't mean he knew everything that this bishop would do or agrees with everything this bishop would do. But it is now a legitimate question to ask, what did Pope Leo know about this guy? Did he, and just because, let's defend Prevost for a second. Just because you're head of the dicastery doesn't mean that you get everything you desire. You're part of a team, and it goes to the Pope, and the Pope makes the ultimate decision, and so Prevost might have even said to Pope Leo, I don't think this guy should be a bishop. He was recommended by Supich and Tobin and a few others, and Pope Francis might have said, no, let's do him. That's who I want. So I don't want to paint poor Pope Leo into a corner, but it does raise the question, as the title of this show is what we're seeing simply the last gasp of the Francis papacy from a bishop who was appointed by Francis, who thinks like Francis, who is a theological progressive, who simply wants to keep the revolution going. Let's keep the revolution going, baby. It's 1975 forever. Is that who we're dealing with? The last gasp of a dying ideology? Or is it a trend?
Yeah.
Are we going to see more bishops like this?
Right.
Who are going to come in? Go ahead.
Yeah. No, good. So, and so let's just take 2 minutes, Larry. Why does it matter what happens at a seminary? Again, just practically speaking, like, what is a seminary? What does it do? What happens when you have a bad one? What happens when you have a good one? Like, what's the significance of that?
Well, for starters, more important than the theology that is taught there is the spiritual formation. And in many, many ways, it's the last place that a young a lot of seminaries, most of them are, training diocesan seminarians, guys who are going to be parish priests, right? And it's the last opportunity they're going to have to live in community, to be spiritually formed. And boy, I'm telling you, having been in the seminary, both minor and major myself, it has a powerful effect. I'm still drawing on the resources of my spiritual formation that I got in this area. It's the greatest gift that God gave to me by sending me to the seminary for a time, even though I ended up not becoming a priest, was that spiritual formation. But I went to Mount St. Mary's, which gave me a great spiritual formation and great spiritual directors. Very, very Marian, Eucharistic. You get the picture. Yeah. Other seminaries, however, no, that spiritual formation was not there. Prayer was not emphasized. Praxis is more important than contemplation. And they pitted doctrine against mercy, truth against mercy, and praxis against prayer. And that became a sort of mantra of the activist priest. So the spiritual formation matters, but then also the theology matters. Because also the fact of the matter is that most diocesan priests, and I don't mean to engage in too much calumny here, but it's the last time they're ever going to read a book. Okay, at least a serious theology book, because they're in their defense, they're
busy. Yeah, they're busy.
Yeah. You're in graduate school. You're getting a master's degree. You're getting 120 credits across the spectrum of all kinds of you're reading great books and so on. And if you're instead of reading, the heretics like Hans Kung and Edward Skillebeck, let's say you're reading Joseph Ratzinger and Jean Daniel, Henry de Lubac, even Gary Goulagrange, you're reading those guys. You're going to get a whole, and these are the last great theological books you're probably going to read in your life. They might still be on your shelf in your room, in your rectory that you turn to from time to time. That's why it's important. It matters what these guys think theologically.
Right, because it plants the seeds. I mean, that's the word itself is seminary, right? You're planting the seeds to grow something down. Well,
especially, and I neglected to mention, especially in moral theology.
Right.
Because if you're a young man, say 25 years old, and you go into your third theology, moral theology class, and your moral theology professor is a consequentialist proportionalist. And he stands up there and gives you 87 reasons why you can tell people in the confessional that it's okay to contracept. It's okay to cohabitate. It's okay to masturbate. It's okay to have a gay relationship. In other words, it's sex. nobody ever says it's okay to be a racist.
That's right. That's right.
Nobody ever says, well, I am a racist, but it's the best I can do right now. So the best I can do is who kicks in and says, oh, okay. I know you're a grand wizard of the KKK. I have to break those cultural ranks.
Or Larry, I have a certain weakness for murder. I really like murdering.
Yeah.
Now I know I'm being somewhat silly here, but you get the point, and I get your point. I think our audience understands the point, right?
I mean, good enoughism. And if you're getting good enoughism in the sexual domain in your moral theology class in seminary, then as happened in the 60s and 70s, an entire generation of priests goes out there and says, okay, here's what the church teaches. That's kind of an ideal. Mm-hmm. But down here in the trenches, it's okay. Just do whatever you want. Follow your conscience. And then they also get this whole theology of the primacy of conscience that deals with the conscience as a kind of Tweety bird inside your brain that invents moral principles for you, and not as Cardinal Newman understood. And they invoke Newman all the time, problematically.
Dastardly.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Newman understood that, conscience is the last word, but a conscience that's well formed. It's possible for a conscience to be erroneous, for crying out loud.
Right. Of course. Okay. So again, I'm not a theologian. So the seminary has both the intellectual formation component, but it also significantly has a kind of spiritual, moral formation as well.
Yes.
Okay. So the new guy comes in here, right? Bishop Weisenburger, and I got the impression, Larry, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that the Sacred Heart Seminary in Detroit, much against its reputation in the 70s and 80s, has become a kind of stalwart, faithful, Orthodox seminary.
Yes.
Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it, along with when Bishop Barron was rector there at Mundelein, Mount St. Mary's in Emmitsburg, St. Charles in Philadelphia, St. Patrick's in Menlo Park, California. These are now considered to be the major Orthodox seminaries.
Right. So
you know what? Here's an interesting thing about Mundelein, that Cardinal George put Barron in charge of it to clean it up, and he did, and had great professors there. Not even Cardinal Supich, Mr. Liberal Progressive Cardinal Supich, the thug of Chicago, who has no problem whacking people's heads off if they get in his way. He really did. He got rid of the Liturgical Institute at Mundelein, but he really didn't touch the seminary.
I think he has more subtle ways, if I'm being frank. I think Supich is not. He does not play with a warhammer. He plays with a scimitar, in my estimation. But fine, okay. So all right. So this new guy, who is he? Why? What's going on? Why would he's brand new in Detroit. I believe he came in March. If I'm
March,
memories are
right. This is July.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
So he comes in at the end of the spring, in the middle of the spring semester. Graduation, etc., ordination season, summertime, and now before the fall term starts, it's whack, whack, whack. It looks like it's a hit, right? And I'm deliberately invoking the language of the mafia or La Cosa Nostra. It feels that way, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does kind of feel like a Cosa Nostra. As I said in a blog post some time ago, it's a capo regime.
Right.
You like you said, the Supich wields a scimitar, so it's a capo regime situation where you send out your underlings to go do your dirty work for you, and there is this sense of we're gonna whack you. Yeah, you spoke against us, so we're gonna whack you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of how this comes across. It's just sad. This does not treat people with dignity, for starters. And I do hope that they all seek canonical counsel and challenge this. I did get a message from a friend of mine who is involved with Detroit, knows the scene there well, who says that the other bishops in Detroit are actually quite upset with this new archbishop. The other bishops in Michigan are upset with the Archbishop of Detroit. And how lovely would it be to actually invoke a vos estis investigation of this bishop? In other words, so far under Pope Francis, I don't know how it's going to go under Leo, the only bishops that ever got investigated were the conservative ones like Strickland or the guy out in Puerto Rico that was summarily canned.
Well, there was that fella in, what was it, Kentucky or Tennessee? He was kind of a weirdo, and I think he got possessed, to use the slang term. But right, I mean, and remember, like a big major seminary like Sacred Heart in Detroit, it's not just the Detroit Archdiocese. It's a lot of regional dioceses, don't have their own full seminary, so they send their guys up to Sacred Heart.
That's right.
So it's not just his own little playground. I mean, he's really flexing in some pretty significant ways.
Yes, he is. And I want to come back to the alleged problematic here, which is that we're dealing with professors that have leveled certain criticisms against Pope Francis. And so the question going forward is, are seminaries to simply be places that rubber stamp whatever the latest papal message is, or are they to be true places of theological formation and spiritual formation that play? Obviously, you give the Pope, the benefit of the doubt.
Of course,
obviously, you spend a ton of time explicating what it is that the Pope thinks. But at the end of the day, also, you give to the young men a healthy, well-rounded theology of the papacy that causes you to understand that everything a Pope says has to be placed within the context of the broader tradition. Right. And not just the major markers of the tradition, but to know enough theology to know, modern theology, in what stream of thought is the Pope right now, to be able to do what I'm doing here, what you're doing here, and others are able to do here. It's because we know theology. Mm-hmm. And so we can say, okay, I understand that language. I know where that's coming from. And so therefore we, need to take that with a grain of salt, because it's just, that's so played. No, my point is, are seminary professors allowed to call into question a papal statement, say fiducia supplicans, and say, guys, I know he's the Pope, but man, here's why this is problematic. Mm-hmm. Are we allowed to do that now? That's the question I would ask.
That's the great question. Can I change tacks just a second here, Larry?
Yeah.
I want to talk about bishops, and I want to talk about, like, how does one become a bishop technically?
Well, it happens first on the national level, where a see comes open, diocese comes open, and the apostolic nuncio then meets with representatives of the National Episcopal Conference. And that Episcopal Conference then gives the nuncio several names, and the nuncio knows that nation well enough and personnel well enough. He goes through the files, and he has a conversation then with the leaders of the Episcopal Conference. And there's give and take. There's behind the scenes push and shove and politicking. But when all is said and done, the nuncio comes to an agreement with the leaders of the Episcopal Conference on a list of names, say 5 or 6 or whatever. And that list of names that are then kind of even prioritized are sent to the dicastery for bishops in Rome. And that dicastery then vets every single one of those names, and maybe even adds one of their own that they have in mind. And they have a conversation about it. They then make their recommendation to the Pope, and the Pope then decides, yes, I agree with your decision. Okay. Or the Pope vetoes the dicastery and says, here's the guy I want. So you never really ever know, number one, who was on the list. That's always a secret. Who was on the list? Why were they on the list? And what was said about each one of these guys in Rome, and what recommendation was sent to the Pope?
Okay, good. That's good. All right. So it's got there's sort of several tiers here. There's a roster, and it gets vetted by the nuncio and the Episcopal Conference. Those names get kicked back up to Rome, and then there's a sort of a group that sort of vets those candidates there, and then suggestions are made from that smaller group up to the Pope himself, and the Pope says yes, this guy, or no, not this guy, another guy. Okay. How do you get on the roster to start to begin with? You were in seminary. You taught theology for years. How does a young man we use this phrase, a couple of months ago when Pope Francis passed away, and we were streaming live here on, who was papabile and all that sort of stuff. Who is papal? Like how do you become bishopable? How do you become someone who is to be considered to get on the roster in the first place? And I'm asking you this technically, and then I'm going to ask you the second question, really.
Yeah, it involves simply a priest emerging out of the common priesthood of his brother priest.
The soup.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, actually, out of the soup, because he becomes a pastor of a very significant, large urban parish, and he does very well there. And then he gets moved to another very significant, large urban parish, and he does very well there. And then he becomes a Monsignor. Then all of a sudden, he's the Vicar General of the diocese. So he has administrative experience. And then he goes to clergy meetings and, and so on and so forth. Over time, it's actually it's a small world, Cale. The clerical world. In other words, let's say there's 50,000 American priests. At any given time, there's going to be about 500 of them that are in a sense in the upper tier of they're seminary rectors, they're pastors of major parishes, they're vicar generals of dioceses.
Okay, but what about those guys? And that's fine. That's the basic flow chart. That's the official flow chart, right? Yeah. That's that pastoral success translates to success, to being elevated to a chancery, and the success at the chancery gets elevated into the upper echelons of a diocese, and it sort of works its way up there. But what about those guys who are pre-selected in their seminary formation days? It's like, that's going to be a guy we want to tap, not that guy, right? Because we both know, you and I both know examples of bishops who seemingly have this meteoric rise. Like, some of them have never even had an actual pastoral appointment, except they'll give them one right at the end just to sort of say, see, he was a pastor once, and then they sort of send him up the chain. Like, what's going on there?
Yeah, that's true. If it wasn't for the reality you're describing, theological orientation matters in this regard. All right. As you're a seminarian and you say you're liberal seminarian, and so you're going to catch the eye of those liberals in the seminary higher up who say, okay, this is a guy that we need to push along. This is a guy whose career we need to watch and promote. And so you're absolutely correct. There are going to be favored darlings beginning in the seminary that work their way through. And this is where the lavender mafia, so-called, comes in, because it helped if you were, back in the day, 70s, 80s, it helped if you were gay and gay friendly and so on. I hate to sound obsessed with that issue. I'm not. It's just that I was in seminary and I know that was a reality. And it in some seminaries it hurt your cause. In other seminaries it helped your cause. But I'll say this: the best thing that happened to the business of the Roman colleges and Roman seminaries and Roman education was precisely the factor you're describing. Because the best way to become a bishop someday, if you were an American, was to be a seminarian at the North American College.
Go to the NAC. And just for our audience, just so our audience understands, what's happening to the NAC right now? So first of all, the North American College, what is it? North American. It's basically, it's sort of like the Ivy League of the American seminaries, isn't it? Right?
Yeah.
How do you get to the NAC? And then now tell me what's going on at the NAC as we speak.
First off, the NAC is more of a house of formation and residence than it is a college, because the guys that are there actually then attend like the Angelicum or the Gregorian or the Santa Croce. There are various other than universities, pontifical, that they will attend while there. Right. The NAC is just kind of a place where they live. Well, what's going on there now, I've heard rumors, all right, that there was a sort of gay subculture there that's been covered up, and that there have been seminarians that were whistleblowers about that gay subculture that have been given grief by Cardinal Dolan and a few others. Yep. I hate to drag Cardinal Dolan. I like Cardinal Dolan a lot.
Well, I don't. So
I know you don't.
I'll be the turd in the punch bowl.
Well, go ahead. You know what? We are free.
Look, here's the thing.
We're free, Cale, once in a while, not to agree with each other.
Yeah, you and I, and I have nothing to lose because I teach literature for a living, and who cares about me, right? The NAC is a kind of treat. In order to get to the knack, you have to basically catch the eye of someone above you, and sexually or otherwise, I don't know, but you have to catch the eye of some superior, and you get airlifted from your podunk diocese and dumped into Rome and all of its splendor and its wealth and its corruption, right? So you get to go there, and what do you learn there? Sure, you might take a class here. There's sure there might be some spiritual formation, but the thing that nobody talks about is the social formation that happens, because this list that you've given us on paper, fine and well enough, but at the end of the day, you know that friends make you bishops, friends make you vicar generals of dioceses, friends put you on the fast track. And well, then
that's
how do these friendships, these special relationships happen?
That's exactly right. You go to the knack, you get into the good graces of power brokers, you go back to your home diocese, and even as a young priest, suddenly now you have this meteoric rise in your career, and you're promoted to this and promoted to that, and all of a sudden you're on the list to become a bishop someplace.
Right.
Yeah.
And
I want to say one thing though. I'm not at all saying that Cardinal Dolan is above criticism. There are things about him I too would criticize. I just think. Well, anyway,
Well, look, the reason why I don't care, saying I don't care for him, is that the hierarchy continues to run cover for its worst predators in their ranks. And it seems to me, Larry, that the surefire way to ascend up the ranks is that you're willing to throw yourself on bombs. And these bombs are almost always personal picadillos, right? And how good are you at lying?
Wow.
And I have so many stories. I have so many stories of people I know, friends who got hit on by the wrong guy, and all of a sudden they're on the outs, right? And because the guy who hit on him is like really chummy with the bishop. And then you have this culture. So that's what I'm talking about, this culture of omerta, right? This, the code that, and if you look at somebody like, and again, I'm speculating here, people, if you look at the rise of somebody like Weisenburger? Look at what he's been tasked with doing. At each of his stops, he's been tasked with handling sexual abuse stuff. Okay. How do you become an archbishop of arguably probably the most sort of traditional-ish, conservative-ish diocese in the country? Well, because you're not afraid to lie. Yeah. You'll do it because the more you salute, the higher up you go. And I can't help but think that this is part of the dynamic going. In other words, I don't think this has anything to do with Martin. This doesn't have anything to do with Echeverria or Peters. They're just like tall poppies that get whacked, or they're convenient to whack. And look, maybe there's some other stuff going on in these dioceses that, maybe it was time for them to retire. But retiring, as you said earlier, retiring versus getting whacked are two totally different things. But what if these are, it's like people always talk about like gang initiations. Like in order to get initiated in the gang, it means you got to go kill somebody. You got to go whack somebody.
Well, yeah. And the reason why you whack somebody in the mafia is because unless you do whack them, you are going to encourage more of the activity that you disapprove of.
That's right.
You're sending a signal. So here's my point. That the reason why these guys were not allowed to retire with dignity is because Weisenburger wanted to send a message. If you cross me, if you do not toe the Pope Francis progressive line, you're going to get whacked. This is going to happen to you too. So this is why he did it the way he did it. It's because he sends a message. It's a clear message. Toe the line and do what you're told, or else. Now, to go back to the thing about lying, there's various ways for a person to be deceptive, to lie. And I think you're absolutely correct that the omerta, the cone of silence, is the number one way that modern bishops lie. They simply lie by omission, by not saying anything. Where are the other bishops in the United States when another bishop does something outrageously stupid? They sit on their hands and they wash their hands of it like, well, that's another guy's diocese. That's none of my business. That's none of my business.
My business. Right? Yeah, none not my monkeys. Not my monkeys, not my circus. That's so sad.
Yeah, okay, go ahead. All of a sudden, each bishop in his diocese is like a separated fiefdom and king. There's no such thing any longer as a National Episcopal Conference. There's no such thing any longer as collegiality or fraternal correction or any of that sort of stuff. By the way, which you saw all the time in the early church. You saw fraternal correction, bishop to bishop, all the time in the early church. Now there's this unspoken rule. You don't say anything bad publicly about a fellow bishop, ever. That, to me, is the number one form of mendacity in the current episcopacy of the United States. And by the way, there are bishop friends of mine, dear friends of mine, who are bishops, who I think are guilty of this.
If I could just push back on that a little bit. In other words, there's a kind of go along to get along-ism, that there's a don't want to rock the boat.
Or that I have bigger fish to fry, and I don't want to jeopardize those fish that I want to fry by getting involved in this sidebar controversy over here. I need to stay the course and focus on what I'm focusing on. And everyone's going to leap to the clue. Oh, he's talking about Robert Barrett. No, I'm not. I'm talking about a few other bishops that I have in mind that are very dear friends of mine who, they just don't. They remain silent. I think it's because I got enough headaches. I got 3 lawsuits I'm dealing with, 5 parishes that need a new roof. I don't have enough priests. Blah, 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 blah. I got this other crisis going on. Why in the hell do I want to get involved in what's going on in Detroit? I think that's the mentality.
And effectively, I understand that. But guess what? You're not a branch manager, right? You're a bishop. And I guess, to me, I can't help but see sort of, whether Weisenburger has any direct link to, or twice removed link to somebody like Theodore McCarrick. I don't know. But I can't help but think that the continued presence of Uncle Ted and his nephews, that has never been pulled out, that has never been extricated, that has been, in fact, further ensconced into the power structures of the church, at least here in the United States of America, that this is the ongoing mess that comes from the lies of a Ted McCarrick.
Absolutely. And we will probably never know the full truth about the cover-up involving Ted McCarrick, because Pope Francis made sure that it was he issued that so-called investigation, which was just a whitewashing of his own papacy, placing the blame on John Paul II, long deceased, could no longer defend himself. How convenient. And then said, okay, that there's nothing else to see here, move along, without ever raising the question, well, what other American bishops were complicit in his rise to fame? What other, like Donald Worrell, a complete liar. You talk about bishops that lie, and maybe he got into. He's very prissy, he's very effeminate, and he's a real mama's boy, prissy bishop who benefited from Ted McCarrick, knew about Ted McCarrick, then lied about knowing about Ted McCarrick, and yet whatever happened. I ran into Bishop Worrell when I was in Rome covering the conclave. We were part of a crowd. I ran into him. Oh, hey, Bishop Worrell. I wanted to confront him, but of course you don't do that. It's not. I'm not an idiot, and I'm not an asshole.
Despite what they say, Larry. Despite what they say.
I cordially greeted him and said, "Okay, it's nice to meet you." Blah blah blah. But in reality, he's a liar. And Supich has got to be a liar. McElroy's a liar. Tobin's a liar. Cardinal Farrell in Rome, a liar. He lived with McCarrick. I was in seminary. My roommate was a guy from Metuchen when McCarrick was bishop there. 1982. 1982, my Metuchen seminarian roommate at Mount St. Mary's gives me the whole skinny on Ted McCarrick and his beach house. And McCarrick, the reason why the conversation came up was McCarrick was visiting. And I said, and my friend said, I'm going to leave the seminary for the weekend. And I said, why? Your bishop's here. He goes, that's exactly why I'm leaving.
Wow.
And he proceeded to say, because I don't want to get invited to the beach house. I don't want to be in his crosshairs. But now, if this was common knowledge in 1982. 1982, when he was still Bishop of Metuchen. All right. So this is your point exactly. There is a code of silence, which then progresses into a form of just straight up lying about what you knew and what you didn't know, because you begin to see that McCarrick is favored, influential, and can help your own ecclesiastical career. And that kind of careerism is supposedly what Pope Francis was so opposed to, and yet he aided and promoted it in every way he could.
And that's, and I remember early on in Pope Francis's papacy, when he talked about clericalism, and he talked about, those sorts of things. I remember feeling really kind of pumped about that, because I was like, oh, wow. So somebody might actually start doing something. He might care about this sort of stuff. But what, so part of my, dark pilling on all this is that actually he didn't mean it at all. In fact, he did everything in his power to run cover for the worst of the worst, not just Rupnik, but Zanchetta and all these other guys.
And there were the guy to talk to about this is Chris Altieri, the former Vatican radio guy and now a journalist and TV. Yeah. I mean, he's got a list of like 8 bishops and so forth that Pope Francis just turned a blind eye to their sexual abuse or covering up
and not just a blind eye, Larry. I think that's actually being too nice about it. Actually using the force of his office to run cover for it. That's to me what is the most despicable part of this. And never have I heard a Pope-splainer take that head on, other than to deflect and to deny. And I think that's sad. I think that's sad.
Pope Francis was very aggressive in calling people names if they called into question his treatment of these people. It's
all right. All right, so we'll continue. Folks in the audience, I've got 475 people who are currently watching. Welcome, everybody. I'm super excited to have you on here to hear me talk with Larry. I would love if you have a question for me or for Larry or for the both of us, if you could put it in the chat with 3 question marks so that I can see it on my scroll. Larry, while people are doing that, do you think I'm off base by looking at somebody like Weisenburger? So, folks, go ahead and put your questions in the comments, and I'll ask this last question of Larry, and then get to your questions. Is Weisenburger a kind of fixer?
Well, that's an interesting question. I have no way of knowing. I really don't know that much about Weisenburger. All I know is that he was someone supposedly a cleaner-upper of sex abuse problems. Mm-hmm. And he was one of Pope Francis's last appointments as bishop in the American Church.
Right.
And now all I know is what everybody else knows in terms of the public moves from this bishop. I'm not privy to his mindset, his theology, or any of it. But so far, it's not looking good. I mean, if you're a ressourcement or even a traditionalist or a Thomist or a communio guy, it's not looking good. This is not a good look. He's purged the seminary of conservative dudes. He's banned the Latin Mass in effect.
And ad orientem. I think that's crazy.
The Pope himself, Pope Leo, has recently said a Novus Ordo liturgy ad orientem, but apparently this is just beyond the pale.
Right.
But you know what it is too. What Weisenburger is doing here, what this is he's sending a message, which is, I believe that allowing these traditional elements into the Novus Ordo is simply a gateway drug to traditionalism. So just as I don't think marijuana is that bad, but I'm going to criminalize it because it's a gateway drug to bigger things. So here, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, and I can't help but think it on some level hovering, as you have pointed out many times when we have streamed or recorded, that what Popes John Paul II and Benedict were attempting to do was offer a kind of definitive explanation and interpretation of what the Second Vatican Council meant. And clearly, in the last 12 years, we have lived through an alternative interpretation of that explanation or hermeneutic. And so back to, I guess, the opening question. I did have we'll get to the audience question in just a minute. Do you think that this is the last gasp, or is it a trend? Again, gut reaction. I know you don't know. It's a crystal ball type.
Well, that's just the answer to that question resides in the mind of the current occupant of the Apostolic Palace, because we won't know yet. We still have no idea.
Yeah, it's a blank slate. We're in the I call it the blank slate portion of the papacy.
Yeah, we're so desperate, and we were so beleaguered and so beaten down by the last pope that we're grasping at straws like, oh, look, he came out in full papal garb under the loggia. Right. He's going to live at the Apostolic Papa. Oh, he went to Castel Gandolfo. Oh, he said Mass in Latin, ad orientem. So we're grasping at all of these hopeful signs. But the rubber will meet the road when we find out what his episcopal appointments are. So the fact is, it could be a last gasp and a trend. It could be that Weisenburger is the last gasp of the Francis papacy, and bishops like him, appointed in the last year of the Francis papacy, now represent the last gasp of that papacy. And depending on what Pope Leo does, it could be a trend of even more bishops cut out of that same mold. That could be a trend. Now, everything I know, though, about Pope Leo would indicate to me that I don't think he's a hard ideologue in the way that Pope Francis was. I think that Pope Leo really does care about ecclesial unity, ecclesial peace. He seems to be less vindictive and to have a more congenial pastoral soul. And so I have hope that even though we're probably not going to get the laundry list of episcopal appointments that you and I would like to see, it's not going to be an unmitigated disaster either. I think it's going to be a mixed bag. Which,
in my way of saying, could be an unmitigated disaster in the end. But fair enough.
Well, depending on, we'll see. Who replaces Supich? Who replaces Dolan?
Yeah.
Those two, that's going to be key.
Big ones.
Key, especially since Leo is from Chicago.
I know.
Okay, so that is, he's going to pay attention to who he puts into Chicago. Yeah. So I say this to everybody listening. If you want to know what's in the mind of Pope Leo and what direction the church is going to go under the leadership of Pope Leo, just wait and watch and see who he puts in Chicago.
All right, good. I totally agree. All right. Nate has a question here. Do seminaries offer pensions where these guys let go due to age, saving money, etc.?
Yeah, they do. My wife works at a seminary. A lot of seminary professors, like college professors in general, have accounts with TIA, CREF, which is a sort of investment portfolio. But then, as most college universities do, seminaries will take a percentage of your income and they will contribute to your retirement package. It's like a 70-30 thing where the college puts in 70, you put in 30, you get the deal. And almost every seminary has that. Yeah. So I'm sure that Eduardo and Ralph Martin are eligible for a pension from the seminary. Yes. I'm not worried about them finding. I'm not worried about them finding.
Yeah, I think, but both of us are more concerned what this means, what this portends, and perhaps the symbolic value of it. Okay, Clayton, good friend. Hey, Clayton, how you doing, brother? How do lay people break out of the master-slave dynamic that currently characterizes the relationship between the laity and the clergy? Man, right from the top ropes, Clayton. I love this one. What do you think, Larry? What say you, Larry?
Clayton, darn you. You had to ask this question. The master-slave thing. I mean, because the fact of it is we could do a whole show just on that topic, right? Just a fantastic question. It's why I'm not implacably opposed to synodality in concept. But I just had a recent article come out in where is it coming out? I can't remember now.
I have so many.
Yeah, it may be Catholic World Report or it was in the What We Need Now Substack. It's coming out soon. But anyway, to me, synodality means transparency. We need a transparent church, a church. As I begin my article, I say Satan lives in our secrets, and he thrives on those secrets. And we are right now a church of secrets.
Yeah.
The master, and it goes back to what Mikhail was saying earlier about mendacity and lying, omerta and silence and the sort of good old boys network. It's a much cliched thing, but clericalism in that shade is a terribly destructive, cancerous, metastasizing thing. And it afflicts both conservative and liberal bishops. Look at Archbishop Weisenburger. All right, he makes this decision without consultation, without talking to the professors in question, without seeming to concern himself with their dignity as human beings. He just comes forward and says, "Niet, you're done. No, bye-bye." And he can get away with it. And Eduardo and Ed Peters are just supposed to roll over and take it. Well, to answer your question, Clayton, at least people like Eduardo and Ed Peters and Ralph Martin have maybe canonical recourse. I know I read Ed Peters has sought canonical counsel and so forth. Canon law does protect us, and we can appeal to canon law. But I just had this conversation this morning with my wife, where we were talking about liturgical abuses and so forth, and where, people will write to a chancery office and say, Father Skippy Toes routinely lets parish women, lay women, come up and preach the homily instead of him. And so on and so forth. So they'll write this letter to the chancery complaining about liturgical abuse, and it seems to go into the circular file. They never hear back. There's got to be a way that the laity can, in fact, communicate with the chancery, communicate with their bishop.
One might invoke synodality here.
That's my point.
Hear me out, Larry. Hear me out. Maybe a church and a pope that talked about doing church a new way, maybe we could just sort of actually do that. At least for these matters,
That's my point.
Yeah.
I'm all in favor of a more synodal church where the church, instead of a pyramid, is like a series of Russian nesting dolls where, one layer of the church is embedded in another, but they all fit neatly together. Or probably a better image is St. Paul's. It's a circumcision of charisms in the one body of Christ. All right. A synodal church is going to be a church that's transparent, that has structures in place for the laity to actually have their voice heard. Really heard. The problem I had with the synod on synodality was those stupid listening sessions where, it represented 1% of the Catholic population worldwide, because there was no incentive for lay people to leave their busy lives to come and have a conversation, because it was also bureaucratized. We're going to take your statements, then we're going to take them to a secret chamber and collate and curate. And then that secret chamber is going to send it to a new secret chamber in Rome. And so, you just have no idea whatsoever where any of it was going. So why bother going? And I never went to any of them because I knew my voice wouldn't be heard. Right. My voice is heard in places like this. Right. And maybe, Clayton, to answer your question, more Catholics need to do shit like this. And I'm sorry to use a vulgar term, but you know what? We need laity to rise up and speak like we're speaking now.
Right. And I don't want to get us off into a side tangent, because I do have another question here, Larry, and I know we're running up on time, but it's important to point out that the dynamic that we feel as lay men and women in this regard of not being heard and not being protected, it's alarmingly the case for your rank and file parish priest as well. People don't. The club. There are rings, and there are inner rings, and there's the inner ring, and the inner ring. And priests, many priests, are just as vulnerable to the skullduggery of bad leadership as any of us are, and sometimes worse. And I just think it's worth pointing that out. Like that, when we talk about the Old Boys Network, we're really talking about priests. We're really talking about bishops and vicar generals, and that's sort of the upper leadership. Father Jim at St. Suburbia, he's oftentimes in the same kind of boat that you and I are in.
Oh, I just had a gathering at the farm here. We had a bunch of friends over, two of which were priests. So we know tons and tons and tons of parish priests, and they're all good guys. And you are exactly right. Their voice is almost as marginalized, maybe even more so than ours. Yeah. Because they're kept at arm's length precisely because they're parish priests, and the bishop doesn't want to hear their complaint.
And I tell you what, and they'll be accused of being rigid, or they'll be accused of sort of being a squeaky wheel, and so when I heard Pope Francis use that kind of verbiage, like, it triggered me something fierce, because I've heard good friends of mine get psychological counseling because they're rigid, they're backwardist. Like that is abusive language.
Oh, I mean, I wish all the defenders of Pope Francis, the thing that drive me crazy is they're all so young and they don't have institutional memories. The fact is, in the 70s and 80s, I was in the seminary then, as people hear endlessly, that, that word, rigid, you're rigid, was used against any seminarian. As like in a communist country, would you be labeled a counter-revolutionary if you dared,
reactionary?
If you smuggled in a copy of Shakespeare,
right?
Counter-revolutionary. That's a forbidden book.
Right.
So, if you were a seminarian and you said, you know what, I want to start a rosary club here at the seminary.
Oh, that's like you just put neon lights. I am rigid. I am bad. I'm psychological. Yeah, totally.
You're rigid. We need to send it. Now, in defense, if you were going to open a rosary club, fine, they would kind of tolerate that. But if you were also known as a sort of critic of liberal theology, or
if you objected to having superiors hit on you, let's be frank here, Larry.
Yes,
you and I both know many guys my age, your age, they got chased out of seminary because they did not open themselves up to the advances of people who wanted to sleep with them.
That's right. And that term was rigid. Rigid. Those who were rigid were accusing you of being rigid.
Yeah. How rigid that you won't let some guy sleep with you. So weird. Anyway, okay. I got to get to the next question. It's our last question from Joseph here from X. All right. Welcome, Joseph. Hope you're still with us. What do you think will be the practical effect on enrollment in this seminary in the short term and long term? And this is a good practical question. I think that's an important one.
It's a great question. It all depends on who the bishop chooses to replace these guys. So if he brings in his own guys and they're actually pretty decent, theologically orthodox and sound, then I think not much will happen. But I think he's going to bring in more progressive guys. And I think at that point, the seminary enrollment will crater. I think you're going to see bishops removing their men from the seminary. And I think that the seminary, therefore, may shutter its doors, which may be Weisenburger's aim. It may be his goal to get the seminary to close down.
Okay, why? Like, why would you do that? Like, what would help me out here? I'm a dumb layman. Why would I want my very successful seminary to shut down? I thought if my job, one of my jobs as a bishop is like to make sure that there are more priests to serve the people of Detroit. Like, why would I not want that?
Well, for starters, it's a headache, and there are other regions. All right, it's a bureaucratic headache, and there are other regional seminaries that you could send your own men to, and you don't have to have the responsibility of running this one. Okay. That's just for starters. But second, it's in some ways easier to purge a seminary of conservative elements by eventually having that seminary die than to simply go in and try and replace all the professors with liberal ones, because the seminary is going to die that way too.
Interesting.
So the fact is that Weisenburger, if he wants to keep the seminary open, he's in a lose-lose situation. He wants to keep it open, but he wants it to be a progressive seminary. He probably knows, he should know, that that's a recipe for institutional suicide. That it will crater and the place will die. So in a sense, I think what I'm saying here is that it's a foreseen consequence that he is willing to accept, that he would rather have a dead seminary than a conservative seminary.
Wow.
And I went through this. My undergraduate seminary, St. Pius X in Erlanger, Kentucky, it was run by the Diocese of Covington, Kentucky. And the several bishops of Covington had been very orthodox guys. And in the wake of the Second Vatican Council, they built this conservative orthodox minor seminary. I got a BA in philosophy. It was all St. Thomas Aquinas, Scholastic. You get the picture. We wore clericals, even as young undergraduates. Very, very conservative. So Covington gets a new bishop. The new bishop comes in. He starts firing the more conservative faculty.
At the seminary.
All right?
Yep.
At the seminary. Some of my favorite professors got fired in my senior year there. Then I graduated and left and went on to other things. And gradually the new bishop of Covington kept replacing faculty with liberal faculty. And then the enrollment began to crater and crater and crater. And about 8 years after I had left there, it finally closed its doors. And they sold the property for like $20 bazillion, which They also have dollar signs in their eyes. So the point is, Bishop Hughes was his name. He was a Jadot bishop, a very liberal bishop of the late Paul VI years. And the fact is that he would rather have had a dead minor seminary than a conservative one.
Wow.
And so that's one of the ways that you kill a success. And it was, by the way, the seminary was very successful. It was busting its seams. So here's how you kill a successful conservative seminary. You don't just shut it down. You gradually replace it with progressive guys, and if it dies, it dies.
Yeah. All right. So short term, long term, you think it's the same. You think there's a goal to let's just shut it down. Let's just get rid of this thing.
Yeah, I think he doesn't necessarily want it to be shut down per se, but his attitude is, if it's going to persist as a conservative place, I don't want it. Right. So I'm going to make it liberal, and if it dies, it dies.
Suspiciously similar to the Tulsa honors program with Dr. Jen Frey, that it's like we would rather have a dead honors program rather than the one that Dr. Frey was building that was actually good and believed in what they were doing.
Oh, or Joe Fessio's St. Ignatius Institute at the University of San Francisco.
Perfect example.
Very successful. Let's get rid of it.
Yeah, a couple of my friends were part of that the last two groups before the Jesuits shuttered that.
Go ahead.
No.
No, I mean, this is those who have institutional memory, old enough to remember all of this, know that there is a script. There is a script.
Right. And I guess
better dead than red, better dead than conservative.
That's right. And I think that is what frustrates both of us, right? Yeah. I'm in my 50s, you're in your 60s. It's like we've seen the play. Like we've seen this pattern again and again and again and again. And it's like, stop trying to pretend like we don't know what we know. And I think that's what really, really frustrates me. All right, last question here from a good friend, Mark. You guys clearly have a strong emotional connection with what's going on. We see your fire. Appreciate that, Mark. Again, what are your fears and where would you like to see things heading? That's good. That's a great closing question. Let's close with this question. That's fantastic. You go first, Larry.
My fear is that Pope Leo won't do anything to either in back channels or front channels to rein in the reign of terror of Archbishop Weisenburger. And so Detroit is going to become like Milwaukee became under Weekend.
That's right.
It's going to be a vocational and liturgical wasteland.
Desert.
Catholicism will wither on the vine and die there. There won't be any priestly vocations. People will start leaving the parishes. And once again, better a dead church in Detroit than a conservative church in Detroit. That's how these guys think. Right. Trust me, this is how they think. So that's my fear.
And I just want to reiterate to buttress Larry's fear, and my point just now, this is the pattern we saw again and again. My fear, my cosmic fear is that the brilliance and the truth of the gospel becomes withered. Now, I believe in ultimate things. I believe in the reality and the truth of the gospel in Jesus Christ. But when people blithely say, we've already won, or, Jesus already conquered death, or it's like, I get all that. In the end, I have ultimate hope. But there's lots of collateral damage that occurs when a diocese becomes a wasteland. And in the example that I always use is my friends here in the stream, or my enemies in the stream, I don't care. Look up what happened to Quebec after the Second Vatican Council. Quebec went from being arguably the most Catholic and vibrant and vocation-rich diocese in the world, certainly in North America. And in the span of a decade, becomes it becomes a wasteland and widespread apostasy. That's my fear, Larry.
And it's my fear too, that the revival of Catholic life in certain sections of the church, and there has been a revival of Catholic life in certain sections of the church under JP2 and Benedict and so forth. Pope Francis slowly began the process of strangulation. He began the process of creating enough kudzu vines of obscurity to choke the life right out of things.
Right.
And now that Pope Francis is dead, there might actually be a kind of greater danger.
Interesting.
Those bishops appointed by him who think like him are going to cut through the kudzu and say, okay, this is what Pope Francis really meant. And so we're here to implement it. And Pope Francis won't be around any longer to say anything else to deflect that. Yeah. And so that's my fear too, that the Francis legacy. So my fear is that we will not get strong leadership from Pope Leo to take us in a proper direction. That's another fear. What should happen, therefore, what my hope is that we do get strong leadership from Pope Leo. I'm not expecting Pope Leo to be John Paul III. He didn't call himself John Paul III or Benedict XVII or even a Francis II or a Pius XIII.
Leo's a darn good choice. Leo's a darn good choice.
It's a genius choice, if you ask me, because he bypasses all the baggage of all those other names. Signaling that he's going to be his own man. That's my hope. He's not Francis II. He is his own man. I think he's a very smart man. And I think, therefore, he sees that he cannot simply continue down this path that we've been going down. He's not going to be a trad pope.
I know.
But my hope is that he's going to be a wise pope, a smart pope, who will make some good moves in terms of his episcopal appointments.
Well, as a send-off here, and Larry, I do want to thank you for coming on. Everybody, you need to check out Larry's stuff at gaudium@spes22.com. He writes all over the place. He podcasts himself, and he's gracious enough to come on this live stream with me, my small little podcast, but I do appreciate it. But my concern remains the smiling faces of all the wrong guys just before they announced Leo the 14th. That's my fear. And on that somber note, everybody, I want you to go outside, go touch some grass, go play in the sun, play with your children, and have a great one. Larry, thank you so much again. I appreciate it.
Hey, thanks. It's always fun, Kale.
All right. Take care.
Bye.